Hi, this is Ibarionex from the Candid Frame. As I mentioned in my last video, I was recently in the Dominican Republic on a family trip. And while there, I'm always making photographs. And one of the things that I always sort of ruminate about when I take any trip is what to take with me. And though I have access to a DSLR and a variety of different lenses, I decided to just take my Fujifilm x100s. And that is sort of my default camera in general for photography. But I was sort of going back and forth about whether or not to take the DSLR and the other lenses, just to have a variety of different choices for me. But I'm so glad that I just stuck with just going with the x100s, because that's really all the camera that I needed. And I've talked about this before in the video that I did when I first used the x100s on a trip to Paris. And I kind of want to revisit that because it's been a couple of years since I used that camera for that trip, and I just wanted to sort of update you in terms of how I use the camera now and what kind of difference it makes to my photographs. So let's just jump right into it. All right, here's the first image that I made as part of the trip. It was shot at 125th of a second at f11 and ISO 500. We landed in Santiago, and it takes about 2 hours to go from there to my dad's hometown, Montecristi, which is about 2 hours away. And on the way there, we had a blowout. So, one of the tires blew out, as you can see here, and so we had to get the spare, which was underneath the bottom of the truck, and get it to replace it. And they were struggling with trying to get that tire, the spare tire, from underneath the truck. And while there, I just saw this scene, and I thought it would make a really interesting photograph. I like the sort of the graphic nature of the shot, the worn tire, the line in the asphalt, the feet sticking out from the truck. And almost immediately, I knew that it would be a really interesting shot. And this is one of the things that I'm often trying to do when I'm photographing anything, is that I try to see things graphically. It's really easy to see things literally all the time. You see a chair, you see a tire, you see a church, and the default is to merely just make a document of what I'm seeing. Just make a snapshot, a record of what I saw. But as a photographer, I'm always trying to go beyond that, and I oftentimes will just take a look at the scene and just look at it in terms of shapes, in terms of forms, in terms of relationships of shapes and forms to each other, especially within the context of the frame. And that's what was happening here. I was really conscious of all the elements here: the roundness of the tire, the wornness of the tread, the feet sticking out beneath the truck, the white line. All of those things I was very, very conscious of when I was making the shot. And I only made a couple of frames here because I was really kind of concerned with the cars that were speeding down the road. So I really had to be really hyper conscious because it was a dangerous situation. Just because the cars speed by, they don't slow down, and some of them got uncomfortably close to us as we were changing the tire. So I didn't make as many images as I might normally under a normal circumstances, but I was just making a point to still look carefully at how I was composing the frame. And at first I wasn't going to make any shots because I was more concerned about safety, but I felt like it might be a missed opportunity if I didn't make the shot. And I'm so glad that I did, because this is probably one of my favorite shots from the trip. And it just reminds me that I have to constantly be looking. I have to constantly be seeing, even though we were on our way after a long flight from Los Angeles to get to town and get some rest and get prepared to get over the jet lag. There are always opportunities for photography, and this shot kind of reminds me that even the most mundane of moments, changing a tire, can produce some really interesting photographs. Here's a shot that was made at 1/900th of a second at f8 at ISO 400. Part of the reason why I visited the Dominican Republic is that It marked the 3rd anniversary of my dad's passing, and we were going to have a mass and some ways of honoring my dad while I was there. So on the visit to the cemetery, we were there and we were cleaning up the mausoleum, and just remembering my dad. And while I was there, I noticed the light that was being cast on another mausoleum that was just across the way, and I loved the pattern that light created against the wall. So I just grabbed my young cousin who was there with us, and I just asked him to pose there. And it was, what was critical for me, it was just his position relative to the light, because the light and the shadow really are what drew me there. And I knew I wanted to position them so that his shadow was a part of the shot, and I wanted to make sure that his shadow didn't bleed into the shadow that was being created by the mausoleum that was right behind me and to the left. I didn't want it to bleed into the shadow, so it was a sort of a little careful direction on my part to make sure that he moved just enough to the right that we had some separation between the shadow of his head and the shadow created by the structure. At first, he was looking directly into the camera, and then I just asked him to look slightly to the left and up, and I think that this results in a really, really interesting shot. A lot of people think that, with a 35mm lens, which is the equivalent focal length that you have with the x100, that you should make portraits with it because of distortion. Ideally you want a camera with an 85mm lens or a 105. And I'm always making portraits with the x100s. I'm conscious of the fact that, if I'm really close to my subject, that there is the potential for some distortion there. But I'm aware of that, and that doesn't keep me from doing it, because I think that even though an 85mm lens or something like that might be the ideal focal length for a portrait, that doesn't mean you can't use other focal lengths to make really fantastic photographs of people. I've done it with a 24mm lens. I think the important thing is to be just conscious of the limitations that any camera lens or focal length may have with respect to how you photograph people and how they're rendered with a shot. I think what's more important is to pay attention to all the other elements that make a great portrait. In this case, it's light, it's shadow, it's shape, it's form. It's how, his skin tone, his body stands out in sharp relief to the light color of the mausoleum behind him. I made all these images in color and later transformed them into black and white just because I felt that they worked better as black and white. I'm always shooting in color primarily. And later on, I kind of decide how I want to convert them over to black and white if I think that, the images is just stronger or better by taking out the color. And that was the case here. And I think that overall, the shot works really, really nicely. All right, here is my next shot, made at 125th of a second at f4 at ISO 1600. Now, the majority of shots that I made on this trip were just during times that I was spending with my family. I didn't go out and kind of do the typical type of street shooting that I do normally when I travel. The priority for me this trip was merely just to hang out and be with family. But I was always with my camera, which was one of the reasons I liked the choice that I made to just have the small x100s with me. It's small, it's really virtually invisible. So when we would go into markets or we'd go into people's houses, people weren't really sort of looking at me oddly because I had this big SLR with this big lens and this battery grip. Especially in a small town like this, you really call attention to yourself if you're there shooting with such a big camera. But most people really didn't give me any mind when I was carrying this small camera, and I think for the most part it allowed me, free access to make pictures all the time because people just saw me as, just someone making snapshots. And even though I was very conscious that I was trying to make pictures that are much more than snapshots. But I follow my cousin here on Facebook, and I know he's an avid gym rat, and I wanted to photograph him while he was working out in this gym. And in a later video, I'll talk about the specific challenges I had photographing him in that gym. But towards the end of his workout, I wanted to make a portrait of him, and I asked him to go to the doorway to the gym because the quality of the light there was really nice. And I just got in nice and close with him and made this portrait of him right after he worked out. And he has all this sweat on his face. And he's a real handsome guy. And I really wanted to just make a really impactful portrait of him post-workout. And, the light levels inside the gym are really, really poor, which is one of the things I'm going to talk about in a future video. So the choice to move him towards the doorway was really critical. I knew I needed a good quality of light. And even though the X100s is not a DSLR, like any camera, you really always want to be looking for the quality of the light, because ultimately it's the light that's going to make or break your photograph. And I knew that when I made the choice to make a portrait of him. I was always looking around and thinking about where's the light. So when I knew that I wanted to make a portrait, I had already assessed the overall scene, and I knew that the light from the doorway was going to give me the best possible look. Initially, I made a portrait of him with the lens at wide open, but the depth of field I knew was going to be really too shallow. I would focus on the eyes, but there would be a lack of sharpness on the face, and I knew that I wanted those droplets of sweat to be a really part of the image. So I closed down the aperture down to f4 to make sure that much of his face was relatively sharp. And you can see the fall off in the sharpness or the focus when you look at his shoulders and you look at the area behind him. There's a lot of weightlifting equipment and stuff behind him. I do not want that stuff to be sharp. I want you to get a sense that it is a gym, but I want the emphasis to be on his face. And by going to an aperture f4, it gave me just enough depth of field in order for it to work. Now, as I mentioned before, you have to be aware of distortion when you get really physically close to your subject. And I can literally touch his shoulder if I wanted to. I'm that close. So I have no doubt that this probably has introduced some level of distortion to the face, but it's not really obvious. If you probably shot it with an 85mm lens, you might be able to pick up on it. But whatever distortion that the lens provides because of the proximity of the cameras to the subject here is not immediately discernible. And that's what I mean by just being aware of what the camera is capable of. I knew that if I shot this in the way that I did, I would get a really good result. And I'm really, really pleased with this portrait. And I think the X100s worked splendidly. Okay, the next shot was made at 1/400th of a second at f8 at ISO 200. We spent a lot of time at the beach. We spent hours in the beach in the water. And one of the great things about using the X100S is that I don't hesitate to move into the water to make shots. We could walk pretty far into the sea at this point, and the water was about waist level at first, and as the tide started moving in, it was about at chest level. But I didn't hesitate to take the camera with me. Usually with a DSLR, I'm very wary about taking it to the beach, and much less getting into the water, because if I slip and take a dunk, that's a lot of money that gets basically toasted. But with the X100, if I take a dunk, I'll be heartbroken, but it won't ruin everything, because I can easily replace it, because it's relatively inexpensive a camera to replace should something catastrophic happen. But luckily that wasn't the case. But I really like the fact that I had this really small camera that I could go into the water and just enjoy being in the water and making photographs. And I did a lot of that. I thought that the color of the water, which was so clear, was so beautiful. And while I was out there, I really was, playing around with everyone who was in the water and trying to make a shot in which, I was paying attention to their relative position to each other. One of the things that's really, it's easy for me to do is to simply make a snapshot of someone in the water. And I made a lot of those. But about halfway through, I realized, oh, wait, I need to still think graphically. I still need to think as if I'm out on the street. Because when I'm out on the street and I'm making photographs of people within a space, I'm always thinking about relationships, about the interplay, about how things are revealed in counterpoint to the things that are around them. And in this case, I didn't have any sort of buildings. I didn't have light. I didn't have shadow. I didn't really have the typical elements that I'm usually hunting for when I'm out in the street. but all I had was just the human figures within the frame. And so that's what I started thinking about. When I saw, all these people within the water, I started backing up and started thinking about, okay, how can I use the human figures in this frame in a graphic way and still make a good shot? And so when I saw the little boy in the water sort of start floating on his back, I knew I had something there. So I immediately had to, move back really quickly, but not so quickly that it would fall backwards into the water, because I knew I wanted to position him and compose him in the foreground, and then have my sister and her husband and my cousin all within the frame. And I think I succeeded in making this really, really nice and wonderful triangle that allows you to sort of navigate the frame between all three of them, and you kind of go in this sort of circular fashion. And the setting of the blue and the green of the water, I think, offer a really nice color contrast. The water in this case sets the foundation for the entire photograph, and the people become, again, a graphic element within the shot. And it's, for me, this is all about the relationships of the three figures, but also the four figures, but also about gesture, the way that the boy is extending his head back and his arms are outstretched, the way his mother has that hat it's up to her right cheek, the way my sister and her husband are embracing over to the right. There's a lot of energy and action that's happening with each of the three figures. They're very active, but when they play off of each other, I think it makes it that much more interesting. I think that one of the reasons I like this shot is not only the relationship that I'm able to create with each grouping of figures, but just the fact that they are each having an interesting gesture. And I think it all comes together really, really nicely. And again, using that small of a camera, even though it's not waterproof, really provided me the means to make a shot like this that I don't know whether I would have if I had a big DSLR that I was concerned with. Now here's the last shot that I made at 180th of a second at f4 at ISO 200. Now, one of the features that the camera has, it has basically sort of a built-in ND filter in which it cuts down the amount of light reaching the sensor. If you're not familiar with neutral density filters, usually it's a filter that you put on the front of your lens that cuts down on the amount of light coming in through the camera. And it allows you, in very bright situations, to be able to use slower shutter speeds or wider apertures in order, in most cases, to create a shallower depth of field. And that was the case here. I mean, we were in the middle of the day. It was very bright. But I knew I wanted to have a shallow depth of field, which normally would be almost impossible to do because there's so much light. And the result would be that even at a relatively fast shutter speed, I still would have to use a fairly moderate aperture. But by using the neutral density filter feature of the camera, I was able to shoot at an aperture of f4 that blew out most of the background and still gave me fast enough shutter speed to keep him relatively sharp. I like the fact that I have some blur as he's moving his hands up to his head, and I think it's a really, really fun shot. I was playing with him and I said, hey, you got to act like you're some sort of male model, and I sort of motioned and mimicked what I wanted him to do, and he thought it was very, very funny. And I just love the moment that it creates in terms of the gesture, in terms of his expression. Again, the water and the sky offer a real wonderful color palette, especially the way it contrasts against his white t-shirt and the color of his skin. It just works out really, really nicely. I'm really pleased with the shot and sort of the moment that it captures. I think this and all the other images that I was showing you really are a real testament to making a choice to keep things down to a bare minimum in terms of how much you want to carry. I mean, the fact that I had this small camera that I had on me always, it was always with me, allowed me to make photographs that I don't think I might have made if I was burdened with this, having to carry some sort of shoulder bag or a backpack of equipment all through the day. It could get incredibly hot and humid down there, and if I had to carry a bag with several pounds worth of gear, I would just have gotten really easily fatigued. And the last thing on my mind would have been to make a photograph of anything. And the fact that I have this camera that I could wear around my neck or off my shoulder that was negligible in terms of size and weight really freed me to constantly being able to look for opportunities for photographs, but more importantly, to still and sort of enjoy myself and enjoy my time with my family and my friends, and really have a good time, because I don't want photography to sort of take over everything, but I still want it to be sort of an integral part of what I'm doing. And the best part of it was that people really quickly just got used to me being there with my camera. They were just like, this is just what he does. So there wasn't anything that I wasn't photographing there, but most people were just like, even people who didn't know me very well, just got used to me having the camera present and making pictures. And I think that's really important, whether you're on vacation or whether you're photographing your own family and friends during a barbecue during the summer. Being ever present with a camera, especially a small and compact camera like this, really provides some definite advantages, and it's one of the reasons why I love using it so much. And if you found us for the first time and you've never heard of The Candid Frame, well, I also do a podcast in which I feature conversations with some of the world's best photographers. And I recently interviewed Danny Clinch, who's photographed huge names in music, including Bruce Springsteen, Johnny Cash, Tupac Shakur, Bob Dylan. The interview was so good that I had to spread it out over 2 episodes. So if you go back to episode 332, you'll get the first part of the interview, and we just recently released part 2. It is a must listen to. It's a great, great conversation. We have an app available for the podcast that you can find for Android, Windows, and Apple iOS. You can download it and have access to the complete archive of interviews, and it's completely free. And I normally download pictures from the Candid Frame Flickr pool that I provide critiques for each week. I'll continue to do that, and I'll be producing one in the very near future. But if you want to contribute to that, all you have to do is go to Flickr, do a search on the Candid Frame, and I'll be pulling images from there. But you can also see what other listeners of the Candid Frame are submitting to the community. And if you like what you're seeing here on our YouTube channel, please subscribe. And one of the changes that I've made recently is that episodes of The Candid Frame are now going to be available on YouTube. It's audio only, but if you prefer to use YouTube as an aggregator for your audio and your video content, well, each new episode will be released on the same day that they are released elsewhere, and you can listen to new episodes right here on YouTube. So thanks again for joining me, and I will see you next time.